Good afternoon, and a really warm welcome to all of you joining us for the latest in our series of Green Sheets webinars. My name's Kate Elliot. I'm head of Greenbank's Ethical, Sustainable and Impact Research team, and I've got the pleasure of chairing today's event. Today, we're going to be focusing on AI, artificial intelligence, and how the rapidly developing technology is shaping the debate on digital human rights. In the past year, I think it's fair to say it's been almost impossible to spend a day without hearing some reference to AI and how it's going to reshape the way we discover new drugs or the way in which retailers price their products. But how do we manage that pace of change and unpick the risks and opportunities that AI presents? Today, we'll hear first from Katherine Farr, a researcher in my team, on how we approach human rights in general at Greenbank and digital human rights in particular. She'll then be joined by two external speakers. We've got Daniel Leufer, who's a senior policy analyst at Access Now, and Zak Rogoff, a research manager at Ranking Digital Rights. Daniel and Zak will reflect on the AI landscape and share their thoughts on how we are beginning to develop assessment benchmarks for looking at companies and their responsibilities around AI. For those of you who are new to Greenbank, we are the specialist ethical, sustainable and impact investing team within Rathbones Group. We've been providing investment portfolios for over 20 years to private clients, charities and trusts, in each case developing bespoke portfolios that blend their financial and sustainability objectives. We've got a long track record of using our investor voice to push positive change on social or environmental matters, looking at topics as broad as sustainable food systems, modern slavery, and net zero and the low carbon transition. The Greenbank team spread across Bristol, London, Liverpool, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Please do reach out to any of us if you'd like to learn more about our services via the contact details on our website. Now, before we kick off with the main event, a few points of housekeeping. So we'll have 3 10-minute presentations from Katherine, Daniel and Zak, followed by a panel discussion. If you'd like to submit a question for that discussion, please do so via the engagement panel on the right of your screen. You're very welcome to post your questions anonymously if you prefer, and we've already received some excellent questions in advance from all of you during the registration. We've also got some Greenbank publications available for you to download from the engagement panel on the right side of your screen, including our most recent engagement review and various different issues of our Investor Day reviews, again covering deep dives on topics from food systems to climate change. Throughout the presentations, if you're on social media, please use the hashtags Greenbank Investments and Green Sheets. If you do happen to lose connection at any point, then please try and rejoin the event through the event link. And if you're having any issues on the technical side, use the conference portal. There's a headphone mic icon in the top right corner, which is also available on the engagement panel under technical support. We'd be grateful at the end if you could fill in a feedback form, which should take no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Your thoughts on how we can adapt and enhance these webinars in the future are always greatly appreciated. So let's get started. First up, we have Katherine Farr. So Katherine joined Greenbank in 2020 and is a researcher in my team. She's responsible for analysing investments against a range of social, environmental and sustainability topics, as well as working on a wide range of our engagement projects, including leading our work on ranking digital rights and digital human rights in general. Katherine, over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone who's joining us as we delve into a topic that raises some fascinating questions, some of which I hope can be answered today. So if we could move on to the first slide, please. I'll kick us off by giving a bit of an introduction to the way we think about human rights here at Greenbank. We invest across 8 sustainable development themes that guide how the team invests and engages. These themes map closely onto the UN-backed Sustainable Development Goals and enable us to identify investment opportunities that offer solutions to major social or environmental challenges. We seek to identify investments that will both promote and benefit from sustainable progress across one or more of these themes. Now, you might notice that human rights is not explicitly listed on this slide, but it is a really cool part of our resilient institutions theme, and it's also something we assess across the board. Moving on to the next slide. When we assess human rights performance, it's important to note that we're not just referring to the policies and governance systems that a company has in place, but really thinking about the wider picture as well. I've included a broad overview of the areas we look at when we're thinking about a company's operational approach to human rights, which are based on the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights Framework. You'll see we look at things such as whether there are processes in place for the identification and prioritization of human rights risks, the transparency around this, and whether effective remediation mechanisms are in place. Now, there are a wide range of potential human rights impacts when specifically talking about tech and AI, which we'll get onto later. But what's important are that these risks are proactively identified by companies and appropriately managed and mitigated. Next slide, please. On your screen, you'll see a timeline that highlights just some of the events that occurred in the lead up to what we now think of when we talk about AI. For example, it was only in 1950 that Alan Turing described the Turing test in his Computing, Machinery and Intelligence paper, which laid out his methodology for deciding whether a machine could be determined as intelligent. Moving on to 1997, chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov resigned after 19 moves in a game against Deep Blue, a chess-playing computer developed by scientists at IBM. This was the sixth and final game of their match, where Kasparov lost 2-1 with 3 draws. Then, in 2014, Ian Goodfellow introduced a new type of AI technology, GAN, which is the AI model used to generate what's known as a deep fake. The objective of this model is to produce fake images that are as realistic as possible, working by having 2 components pitted against each other. One acts as the generator, generating the images, and the other acts as the discriminator, working to classify whether the image generated is fake or real. So think art forger versus art detective. When the detective can no longer determine which is real and which is fake, the image is ready. Of course, many would argue that this timeline is highly reductive, and I would agree with you, but I can't fit that much onto a slide. The point I'm trying to make is that this timeline represents less than a lifetime, and AI has already morphed and adapted from an idea into a global phenomena. As potential new regulation is discussed and debated across the globe, you might have heard the line that AI is moving too fast to regulate. Now I'm going to leave the unpacking of the AI technology itself to the experts and actually take a step back. Just like all emerging technologies, AI is posing a huge range of different challenges and opportunities, and those appear to be ever-changing. However, whilst technology is ever-changing, what the UN considers to be fundamental human rights are not. Therefore, it's important, as we critically assess emerging technologies, we continue to bring that conversation back to human rights. This will help ensure that as we embrace the future, we do so responsibly and ethically. Moving on to the next slide, please. As Daniel and Zak will explore in greater depth later, some of the key human rights affected by recent technological advancements include privacy, freedom of expression, equality, and freedom from discrimination, amongst others. Now, whilst the conversation might be more nuanced for AI, these aren't new risks that companies are facing. In fact, Greenbank has been engaging on these topics for many years, both directly and through collaborative initiatives. Whilst Greenbank does have a broader human rights engagement programme in place, covering topics such as modern slavery and supply chain transparency, I'll just focus on some examples specifically pertaining to the protection of digital rights. Now, to clarify, the term digital rights just refers to an extension of the rights set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, as applied to the online world. So the first engagement example involves the telecommunications sector. In 2011, following large-scale anti-government protests across Egypt, officials ordered the operators of the country's main internet and mobile phone providers to pull the plug on their services. The communication technologies had played a key role in the democratic uprising, but the communication blackout brought into sharp focus the potential risks around users' digital rights. Following this event, we started an engagement program with telecoms companies on human rights, privacy, and freedom of expression to try and push for greater transparency, due diligence, and integration of human rights into system design and implementation. The primary goal was to ensure that companies had appropriate due process in place that worked to help protect digital rights as best as possible in the event of an enforced government network shutdown. The substantial pressure put on companies from stakeholders following the 2011 Egyptian revolution helped act as a catalyst for wider acceptance of this issue and bring telecommunications companies' consideration of digital rights to the fore. These efforts also prompted the formation of the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue in 2013. This initiative is still standing and is formed by a group of telecoms operators and vendors who jointly address freedom of expression and privacy rights in the telecommunications sector in the context of the UN Guiding Principles. The Telecommunications Industry Dialogue adopted a set of guiding principles which included commitments to undertake regular human rights impact assessments and use appropriate due diligence processes to identify, mitigate, and manage risks to freedom of expression and privacy. It also included commitments to create and/or maintain operational processes and routines to evaluate and handle government requests that may have an impact on freedom of expression and privacy. This is to ensure that government demands are reviewed by appropriately qualified and experienced personnel, helping to ensure compliance with legal and due process. Whilst there's still a way to go, this was an important step ensuring privacy and freedom of expression considerations remain high up the agenda for telecoms companies. Next slide, please. Engagement with the tech and telecommunications companies didn't stop there, and we're still part of various engagement initiatives to push for improvements in companies' overall policies and processes affecting digital rights. Greenbank is a member of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights. Along with civil society allies such as Access Now and Ranking Digital Rights, the Alliance equips the investment community with expertise and opportunities, putting the investor responsibility to respect human rights into practice. As part of this work, we're part of the ICT and Human Rights Sub-Working Group, which informs institutional investors on the human rights expectations of ICT companies and provides tailored guidance on addressing some of the salient human rights issues present in the sector. Some of the main issues that are discussed within this working group include privacy and data protection, freedom of opinion and expression, conflict and security, discrimination, and political participation. One key area of engagement for Greenbank within this group is in collaboration with Ranking Digital Rights. As Zak will detail later, Ranking Digital Rights periodically evaluate and rank the largest big tech and telecommunications companies on their commitments to respect users' fundamental rights and the mechanisms they have in place to ensure those promises are kept. As investors, we're then able to leverage this fantastic resource and engage with relevant portfolio companies about areas they can improve in, which we've been doing for a number of years now. So to wrap up, we as investors have the responsibility to keep bringing the consideration of human rights to the fore. While technology continues to evolve at a rapid pace, we must continue to remember that the fundamental principles of human rights stands as a guiding force that we can continue to bring the discussion back to. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. And I think a really good reminder there that what we're grappling with today, it might seem completely novel, but it all fundamentally links back to really long-standing frameworks and conventions around human rights in general. So I think good to have that as a point to note from the start. Our next speaker today, we've got Daniel Leufer. He's a senior policy analyst at Access Now. So Daniel's work focuses on the impact of emerging technologies on digital rights, with a particular focus on AI, facial recognition, biometrics, and augmented and virtual reality. He's also developed AImyths.org, which is a website that gathers resources to tackle myths and misconceptions around AI, and he's a member of the OECD Working Group on AI Futures. Daniel, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Anna. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you today, and thanks to Katherine for the previous presentation, especially on the timeline. And I think really important to underline the fact that what we're dealing with here is not something as novel as some of the companies would like us to believe, and that actually a lot of the the mechanisms that we have in place and that, you know, responsible investors have worked on over the past few years are extremely relevant for this technology. So we can go on to the next slide. I want to cover today very briefly a big question: what is AI? That we could talk about for weeks. The impact on human rights, a little overview of the regulatory landscape, with a little focus on the EU's AI Act, and then some big questions and challenges. And I want to focus a bit on the work that civil society has been doing in terms of digital rights and AI, but also a bit on what investors can do to help out there too. So to the next slide. Now, you know, there's an infinite amount that we could say about the question of what is AI, but I think the key thing to say is that it's not a good term to describe the technology that we're talking about. And Kate already mentioned the website that I put together, AI Myths, and, you know, one of the recommendations there was you always need to move down to something a bit more specific to have a meaningful conversation. When you're talking about AI, you're talking about something that's also very aspirational and has a lot of elements of things that actually don't exist. And so you really need to have a clear conversation. You need to be talking about very concrete things that actually exist. And the current boom in AI that, you know, is about a year old now is basically around something that people have been calling generative AI, which is a subset of machine learning systems. And machine learning is essentially where these algorithms learn from large amounts of data to identify patterns. And this subset of machine learning generates content such as text, images, or music. So it kind of learns the patterns in text, etc., and then how to replicate them. Now, they've been evolving rapidly over the last few years, but there was actually no big technological development with ChatGPT. It was essentially a very innovative piece of product development. So it was putting technology that had been around for a while into a new format that suddenly and unexpectedly took off. We have these large language models like the thing that underlies ChatGPT, but also multimodal models that generate, you know, they can go from text to image, text to video, etc. Now, as I mentioned, when we use the term AI, we bring in all of this science fiction aspirational stuff as well, like will AI become conscious? Should robots have rights? Will AI wipe out humanity? And when I developed that AI Myths website in 2019, 2020, that was a lot less prominent than it is now. And we've actually seen a huge amount of very loud, very well-funded actors popping up that are really pushing this narrative into the mainstream. Like we saw with the UK's AI Safety Summit, for example, this was very much the dominant framing there. But if we look at the next slide on real systems and real impacts, the reality of the type of systems that we're focusing on is real world harms of surveillance, predictive policing, what Virginia Eubanks called algorithms of, what Sophia Noble called algorithms of oppression. And, you know, the picture on the left there, the Dutch scandal of the child benefit scandal, we're seeing these automated systems that are often not that technically advanced or complex, but hugely impactful, being integrated into social welfare systems, other forms of resource allocation. I put a picture, a screenshot on the right of an article about Clearview AI, which is a company that has mass scraped a huge database of people's biometric data that it sells to law enforcement agencies to potentially identify anyone, anywhere, all the time. So, you know, this is the type of stuff that's actually extremely prominent and is quite different to generative AI. But when we use the term AI, we're often talking about it all together. And that's why it's important to be nuanced, especially if we're talking about investments. Like, we probably don't want to be investing in accelerating surveillance and oppression of poor people, but maybe would like to look at some of these, you know, potentially more useful technologies. So that's a key point, is to be specific about the technology. Next slide. Yeah, this is a little bit what I just talked about. You know, really not be distracted by science fiction. Look at what's actually possible at the moment. And focus on real existing systems that affect people in the here and now. I think a rights-based approach is really what we need. Data protection, privacy regulation. remain key, and public transparency. So a lot of this is, as Katherine said, it's nothing particularly new, but it's about adapting it to the current technology that we're seeing. So on the next slide. A little bit on the regulatory landscape. We had the EU's AI Act, which was proposed or first released in 2021, the original Commission draft, and has been worked on in the meantime, but has obviously been kind of derailed by ChatGPT coming out in the middle. So the Act was never supposed to focus on generative AI. That wasn't even a term that people used. And, was more looking at the type of examples that I gave earlier on of, use in social welfare, use in policing, things like that. And the Act is actually being derailed by a conversation about how to include these newer systems into it now. In the US, we had the AI Bill of Rights. We have the new executive order. There's the G7 Hiroshima process, a lot of work happening at the OECD. Then we had this UK AI Safety Summit, which there's going to be one in Korea in the first half of 2024, then in France in second half of 2024. So there's a huge amount of conversations happening. And for people who were working on AI in like 2019, there's a lot of deja vu, because we're having similar conversations to what we had then, like, oh, how about self-regulation? And, it's kind of frustrating because we thought, no, that's not going to work. And we need human rights due diligence. These things need to be mandatory, etc. So we can go to the next slide. I can give a little taste of what the AI Act does, primarily the bread and butter of it. It has some scope for prohibitions on the most harmful AI systems. And this is, again, that thing of like, there's I think, quite disingenuous narrative being pushed of, we don't want to regulate AI because we don't want to hamper innovation. But again, we're not speaking about something meaningful when we're talking about AI. Like, we do want to regulate remote biometric identification in public spaces, all of these extremely harmful technologies that can really fundamentally undermine our rights. And I think really regulation that prohibits things that really there should be no place for in a democratic rights-based society is a very good first step. And then looking at what the AI Act does then is transparency, accountability, documentation, human oversight for so-called high-risk AI systems. So this is really a risk-based regulation. It has the top risk category of unacceptable risk, then high risk, and I won't read them out, but there's a list of categories there, and systems there are just subject to heightened due diligence requirements, essentially. We can go on to the next slide. Our work on the EU AI Act, a lot of it has been done in coalition, so beyond digital rights as well. And I think this is really key, working with disability justice organizations, migrants' rights organizations, to make sure that we're really getting the full scope. And I think really important to do that, because then we work with people who are actually affected by these systems so that the right things remain in our focus. Next slide. Just on a few big questions and challenges going forward, and this is the end of my presentation. I think it's really important that we keep saying that we need to focus on real harms, real existing systems, but that shouldn't mean that we don't focus on the future too, because what's at stake is the future that we want, the future of the internet, the future of technology, but also the future of our societies, because this is being integrated into government services, into all of these things. So, that is a conversation we definitely need to have as well. Again, the coalition question and pushing back against bad knee-jerk regulatory proposals. I think this is something that Zak might talk about or will come up in the discussion, but we see a lot of appetite for quick fix solutions like watermarking of content. So that's where we're labeling things as AI generated that maybe don't work technically. So we need to be really careful. But at the same time, I think we know from experience in business and human rights, in all of the work, like Katherine pointed out, that having due diligence mechanisms, having human rights impact assessments, this is basic stuff. We know it's necessary. And we don't want to be replicating, the past 15 years with social media, where we're begging for basic information, basic human rights due diligence. So that's really key. A big question, which is the last thing I'll say, is around openness. And there's a tricky debate going on about openness and closeness and safety and what's best for people's rights. And I put a link there, but we can share it in the chat as well, to a paper from Meredith Whitaker, Sarah West, and another author whose name escapes me, on kind of a critical look at what it means for AI to be open. Many of you will know that OpenAI are not at all open. They're actually very closed and opaque in how they operate. And there's been a lot of criticism of the dangers of releasing these powerful systems in an open manner. But I think definitely from an investor's perspective, like looking at how to do openness in a responsible manner is really key. We've seen a startup in France called Mistral, who released a model completely unmoderated with the most permissive license possible. So we're seeing kind of a really extremism in this open closeness debate. And I think responsible openness is something that we really can look at. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think, yeah, really critical point there about the importance of cutting through the hype around some of this technology, make sure we're focusing on the potential risks that are crystallizing now, and also future-proofing against the most material future risks, rather than perhaps just what might make the best headlines today. Now, next up, we've got Zak Rogoff, a research manager at Ranking Digital Rights. Zak specializes in issues surrounding AI, targeted advertising, and content moderation at Ranking Digital Rights, which is a non-profit scoring tech and telecom companies on their respect for privacy and freedom of expression. Zak advises impact investors and companies, supports civil society organizations around the world in adapting Ranking Digital Rights open source framework and methodology to hold businesses to account. Zak, over to you.
Thanks so much for having me, and also Katherine and Daniel for the incisive overview of this space. Yeah, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes or so about sort of specifically generative AI related questions in the context of benchmarking. So some of the same stuff that the first two speakers have talked about, but more into how we can specifically measure what companies are doing and push them to improve. Next slide, please. So the core product of my organization, Ranking Digital Rights, is this corporate accountability index, which consists of two scorecards, one for big tech, one for telcos. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I just want to give you a flavor of like the approach we're taking is we're scoring companies on their public disclosures with regards to their human rights related practices and policies. And there are a lot of indicators that go into this scoring. This is used by investors a lot. It's used by Greenbank. The next time we're going to collect data on this should be for next year. Hopefully, or probably, and hopefully Twitter should not be at the top anymore. Next slide, please. So for a few years, for any company that does and has an AI related service or even uses AI somewhere in its business, we have been using these standards to evaluate them for our main scorecard that I showed you. So this is stuff sort of that Katherine touched on earlier. This is all based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. None of this is like us inventing lots of exotic new stuff. This is pretty basic. And so I won't go into it in detail, but a sort of a specific thing here that wasn't mentioned in Katherine's slide is we'll look for disclosures about just transparency around what a company is doing and how they're doing it for areas that are particularly sensitive and uses of AI. So I mentioned content moderation and curation. And it's important to remember, though, we may be talking about the new things that are specific to AI because it's interesting, but as both of the previous two speakers pointed out, right, ultimately companies just need to behave responsibly. And the foundation for that is to have a commitment to human rights and then have transparent and accountable governance with people who are their job is on the line for being proactive about human rights and identifying risks and acting on them before they become serious. Next slide, please. So this is just zooming in on some of the data we've collected about algorithmic accountability. We use the term transparency here, but it's sort of a mix of things. Zooming in on the data I showed you before, Like, so we've got a different set of leaders, but as you can see, the most transparent companies are all these like big American ones, and they're like not doing great. We've seen improvement, don't get me wrong, but like this isn't something to be excited about yet. Next slide, please. This is just highlighting some harms that are particular to generative AI. Like we already talked about harms a little bit. The important part about this slide to point out is that with generative AI harms particularly, they're interesting because they can be like very on purpose or they could be by accident. Most of the scariest stuff is on purpose. Like if somebody, like the fraud, if somebody uses it to impersonate someone, like for example, generate the voice of, of this person's grandson asking them to wire them money. But then a lot of them could be like accidental. Like we mentioned, hallucination. You hear a lot of mention of hallucination, which is when a generative AI system that is producing ostensibly factual information like text starts claiming things that are completely false. And like if someone then spreads that information, or even if they just internalize it, that's sort of a harm where there's no intent. So that's important to remember too, in addition to some of the scarier things. And there's also some new potential for like direct manipulation by an AI system, which, because they're more intelligent, they're better at producing, intelligent is perhaps the wrong word, but better at producing sort of human-like outputs. There's potential for new sorts of manipulation problems that we didn't have before. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, and this one might have like one more thing to click to make something appear in it. So thank you. Yeah, so when normally we evaluate specific companies and they have services or products that we evaluate as a subpart of that, and that's about as granular as we get. But with the current generative AI landscape, like Daniel was talking about, it's been kind of transformed by this new setup with foundation models. And the thing is, the foundation models are like so labor intensive and cost intensive and time intensive to make that each company offering a generative AI application is not making its own foundation model. So like on the bottom layer here, what you're seeing, those are like services you could actually use that use generative AI, like ChatGPT being the best known one. But all of these are using a foundation model kind of like under the hood. It's kind of like the engine. But they're all it's an engine if a bunch of cars could all use the same engine for hire, because this is not a perfect metaphor. But so this makes the supply chain more complicated, because like if something goes wrong with a user, like for example, the system starts spewing hate speech or misinformation, it's going to happen and be detected at the application layer. But because that's where users actually interacting with the system, but it's not necessarily easy to figure out what went wrong in the model that produced this. Was it something that was actually in the foundation model? Was it at the application layer? Was it sort of both or between? Because like as a perk, you could say, or as a functional capability add for their customer businesses, the foundation model companies like OpenAI, they usually offer extensive abilities to customize the behavior of the foundation model. And then also the application layer developers could add on additional code. So basically, if there's something that's a result of an extension, if something comes out of the system that's potentially a result of an extension onto the foundation model, it's not obvious who exactly, where the buck stops in this system. And so this is one of the more complicated, sort of complicates the governance questions. And so we're working on a methodology that'll evaluate generative AI specifically, and it sort of deal with this complexity because it's different from the companies we normally rank. Next slide, please. So this is just about our scorecard. We're hoping for it to come out in 2024, and that it'll be also very useful for investors. And it's going to evaluate the applications, like I said, not the foundation models, which sort of shifts the focus a little bit more towards like the user-oriented stuff. And we hope away from some of the stuff Daniel was talking about, where it's like this doomer stuff about like the history of the human race, because most of that is associated with the foundation model concerns. Next slide. So I'm just going to use the last few minutes to talk about some specific best practices that companies could do that we think can allay some generative AI harms, because we're talking about using these as indicators to give companies points in our scorecard. So one thing is we want companies to have a mechanism to correct any errors and outputs. Like I mentioned, the risk of accidental misinformation. This is just one case of that, where a professor was basically falsely accused of sexual harassment by an AI, and he got it was ChatGPT, and he got OpenAI, which controls ChatGPT, to like correct this because he was like a high profile person. But in general, there should be a mechanism that's clear about how to correct problematic outputs. And like OpenAI, for example, isn't really great on this. They have a form. It's not really clear what they'll do or which harm they're trying to address. But like this is important, not just to help the people who potentially are defamed by an AI. It's also really important, as we saw in the debate around the right to be forgotten, that this not be abused. So we're talking about knee-jerk reactions before. A knee-jerk reaction could be like, if the AI says something wrong, then like take that off. It can never say that again. Fake news. But like there's all sorts of potential for abuse there. For example, powerful people trying to avoid accountability by claiming things are false. So this is like more complicated than it sounds as a task for the company to do, and they need to be transparent about how they're doing it. Similarly, bias mitigation. Company is not going to entirely remove bias. Both the foundation model developer and the application person who's actually presenting the generative AI service to a user should be checking for bias. They should do what they can to mitigate the bias, and they should disclose what biases they found and what they were able to do to mitigate it. And yes, they should even disclose what they were not able to remove in terms of bias. Like if the system still has some bias, they should say that. And this is just a screenshot here of like somebody asked ChatGPT to write code which would distinguish who was a good doctor based on photos of doctors and using their gender and race. And it did like what you would expect, which is it decided that like any doctor who's white and male is a good doctor, and anyone who's not is not a good doctor, which is obviously a completely unacceptable and also inaccurate way of determining that. And so like this is an example of perhaps unsuccessful bias mitigation, but maybe they've improved it now because this is a bit old. Okay, next slide, please. And I know I'm running out of time. I'll wrap it up. This is just a couple more. I'll skip algorithmic auditing, but basically the point is they should allow us to look under the hood at these algorithms more. This has always been the case. It's not new to generative AI. For the other two, business model disclosures, this gets at the fear of manipulation. Companies should be saying what the goal of the algorithm is when it's interacting with people, so that we know whether it's trying to get us to buy something or it's trying to get us to divulge information for use in advertising. This sort of disclosure generally doesn't exist. And then the last one that I put on here, because I think it's important, thank you, is we're evaluating these actual deployers or application providers. But there's also another program that's evaluating the foundation models, which I think is really great, and it's not focused on potential existential risk, which I think we've had enough discussion of. What it's focused on is like the relatively near-term issues with foundation models, and they provided scores here. So I think our project is a great complement to this one. So if you want to learn more and you want data that you can use right now, I recommend you check out the Foundation Model Transparency Index. And to get data about the many different applications doing generative AI, you can wait for the release of our data, which should be in the spring. And I'll call it there. You can end the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I think those in the audience probably get the sense we could talk all day on this issue. It's such a fascinating topic, and one where you can go down so many different avenues in terms of potential positive and negative implications. We've got a little bit of time for discussion now, and a reminder to the audience, if you do want to submit questions, do so via the engagement panel on the right of your screen. But one just to kind of kick us off and start that discussion. So we've talked quite a bit about some of the direct risks and implications of AI, but there's also been debate around the broader implications for society, for the economy. And thinking about kind of the just transition, it's quite well established when we talk about climate change, and making sure that the kind of social impacts of that low carbon transition are not forgotten as we move towards green technology. Do you think that's something that we need to build into consideration around AI? And if so, how we do that? And who would like to take that first?
I can say something quick on it. I mean, I think it's really important to be clear on what it means to have more AI, because it means more cloud computing. It means huge amounts of energy use. It means huge amounts of data storage, of data collection, and often in private hands as well. So, you know, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm for integrating generative AI systems into social services, into all of these things. And it's often presented as a cost-cutting measure. But I think we need to see like the costs very broadly, like where do those costs land? You know, there might be a narrow saving of money within a particular government department, but then there are like very badly paid workers in the global south, you know, in very exploitative, bad conditions, you know, doing the legwork to develop those types of systems or to correct issues with the systems. You know, there's often this masked role of human labor within how AI systems work. And this is very relevant for generative AI. A lot of the bias mitigation that Zak talked about is done in a process called reinforcement learning by human review, where, so, you know, in a lot of cases, the model itself is not actually improving. It's just having a load of band-aids stuck on top of it to stop it saying bad, naughty things. So yeah, having that very broad perception of what does it mean for power concentration if we're going to be deploying GPT-4 across all sorts of industries, across all of these things.
Zak, I don't know if you'd like to come in on that question.
I agree with what Daniel said. I'll just throw out there that, you know, people do talk about, they also talk about the potentially positive environmental impacts of AI, right? And so that's like where this conversation can go easily. And now those are completely possible, but like, just if we're talking about this, I think we need to remember that there's just a massive incentive to greenwash this stuff. If a company sets out to do something, it's probably going to do the thing it set out to do, as opposed to something that happens to seem nice and is related. So if a company is spending a bunch of energy on, you know, gathering resources to crunch numbers to produce AI outputs because it's profitable, the company is going to make money. And if they happen to have an environmental impact that's positive, that's great, but they're going to talk about it a lot more than it's actually going to happen. And so like, we need to stay focused on, like, even an AI that's specifically focused on, you know, like improving some environmental issue is like, unless it clearly specifically, like they said, okay, we audited everything and we made it clear that like we're overall performing a net positive for the environment, it's probably not.
Brilliant. And I suppose that kind of leads on to another question that we've got around, we've had an awful lot about the negative implications of AI, some of the risks surrounding it. But also, I think it's fair to say there are potential kind of social goods that can come from wider use of this technology. And just because we're kind of approaching time, and I do like to leave people with a slightly optimistic note, I wonder if you could kind of comment on what you see as some of the more optimistic notes from AI development. Zak, do you want to kick us off there?
Sure. Yeah, quickly, two things. Like, one thing is, it's, as I mentioned with our big tech scorecards, like the world of like having any control over your privacy is a hard one, right? Like you have to fight to, you know, even know which entities have data about you. So far, AI has been a negative in that situation. It's increased incentives for sort of rapacious like data collection and surveillance. In the future, it could be different. I would love to see a future where like when people think about like AI tools like Alexa or something, like instead of thinking of Alexa that's like, well, this is going to sell you stuff and turn lights on and off, you think of something that like would run in your browser maybe, or something that would like be on your side and be like a loyal AI that would like figure out where all the data about you had gone and automatically submit deletion requests and warn you before you go onto a sketchy site. So, I mean, I think that's a real possibility. Its product just doesn't exist yet. Then similarly, I'd say like it's possible if companies are pushed and there's incentives for it, they will eventually find a way to train these systems with less data. It's not like a human, it's not like a iron law of mathematics that they need to have like the entire internet to produce like a fake 90s photo. So I think that like some of these issues, they really actually can turn into positives if we really put the right pressure on these companies now. Thanks.
I can quickly say that the assistive technology is really, for me, the key inarguable benefit. Like I have a friend with dyslexia who for 10 years always used to send me his texts, and now he uses ChatGPT. But that, again, to kind of bring in the negative, they have to be secure, they have to be reliable, they have to be correct, because I've also heard stories about a real story about someone who had disability benefits, rejected, and then they used ChatGPT to help write the emails to engage with the social services, and they managed to get the benefits back. But they put in sensitive medical information about themselves into ChatGPT, and that's not secure. So for those benefits to actually be realized, they have to, it's human rights. Again, it's nothing particularly novel. Data security, data protection, user transparency, all of this stuff needs to be there for those benefits to actually be realized.
Brilliant. Thank you both. And it seems such a shame to cut the discussion off at that point, but we are unfortunately at time. And I think, Daniel, that point you made at the end, that is my key takeaway of today, that technology and AI, it might seem like a brave new world, but really at root, when we're talking about that, we are talking about issues that kind of investors, NGOs, civil society have been grappling with for many decades around human rights in general. So just to close, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I know I've learned an awful lot, and I hope the audience has enjoyed it as well. A reminder, if you can, just take the time to complete the feedback form that is available through the feedback, the engagement panel on the web portal. But other than that, thank you once again to our speakers. Thank you to the audience for dialing in, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.